Welcome to today's webinar, Post-Harvest Handling. This webinar will discuss and identify potential routes of contamination in harvest and post-harvest settings, including harvest, washing, storage, packing, cooling, and transportation. We will discuss key parts of pest control programs and key principles associated with cleaning and transporting produce, as well as corrective actions that can be taken to reduce risk and key record-keeping requirements. This webinar is part of a series of food safety webinars coordinated and conducted by the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative to help Native American farmers, ranchers, and food producers to begin to understand the importance of food safety and what is necessary to reach compliance under the Food Safety Modernization Act. Today's presentation is made possible through a 3-year cooperative agreement between the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and IFAI to provide Native American outreach, training, technical assistance, and education to ensure compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. IFAI is also scheduling a series of in-person food safety trainings in regional locations. I encourage you to visit our website at nativeFoodSafety.org for a listing of these trainings and information on how to register. The in-person training events will fulfill the training requirement for the Produce Safety Rule. The webinars we are hosting will help you better understand these issues and will help you prepare to participate more deeply in regional training events. All attendees will be muted during today's presentation. After the presentation, I will answer questions. Attendees can submit a question at any time during the presentation by using the questions feature of the control panel. My name is Blake Jackson, and I am a policy officer and a staff attorney here at the initiative. At the University of Arkansas, we're located in the Office of Economic Development. I've been involved in combined with federal Indian law and analyzing agricultural policy issues for about 4 years, working at the initiative here for 1 year this month. So with that, without further ado, I'll get going. Today's module that we're covering is Module 6, Post-Harvest Handling and Sanitation. The learning objectives for today are identifying potential routes of contamination associated with harvest and post-harvest activities, identifying practices that reduce those risks, identifying the steps involved in cleaning and sanitizing food contact surfaces, defining key parts of a pest control program, describing key practices for transporting fresh produce that will reduce contamination risks, listing key practices that need to be monitored during post-harvest activities, describing corrective actions that reduce the risks, and identifying key records to document practices. Starting out here, thinking of fresh produce as a ready-to-eat food may be a new idea, but maybe not. But it helps to highlight the importance of sanitation, because fruits and vegetables that are eaten raw are not cooked or otherwise processed to kill microorganisms that might be present. So produce must be protected from contamination. And the first part of any sanitation program is to keep things clean. The Produce Safety Rule includes standards for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding activities, which includes standards for equipment, tools, buildings, and sanitation. And these are all discussed throughout the module. So as you can see, basic housekeeping is kind of the first thing that we talk about here. Organizing the farm so that produce handling areas are separate from tractor repair, animal care, or any other farm tasks that could introduce food safety risks. And this is just probably a lot of things that you might already be doing on your operation, but it's important to know to kind of spell it out a little bit. So, because there might be some risks that could produce food safety issues that you might not have thought about, when you go through and do an inventory for what's required under this rule. Some of the basic practices are required in the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, and they're detailed later in this module, but examples of those are disposing of trash and eliminating pests. And in the most practical terms, guys, this just means sweeping, emptying trash in coal piles and containers daily, cleaning up spills, and developing pest control programs. So the underlying thing here is just making sure that your area is clean to avoid any kind of cross-contamination issue and having good housekeeping practices. Once these practices are in place, implementing the 4 steps to cleaning and sanitizing that we'll discuss later. Cleaning and sanitizing surfaces are required in some cases, for instance, with food contact surfaces, but it's not possible to sanitize every surface. I mean, that's not an easy ask. But when possible, the 4 steps could be completed to keep reusable harvest containers, tools, grading tables, packing, and equipment clean to reduce the presence of microorganisms. The 4 steps to cleaning and sanitizing will be discussed later in this module. The thing here is that worker training for harvest and post-harvest practices. It's important to know that workers are key to ensuring harvest and post-harvest activities are done properly, so they must be trained. Um, Worker training was discussed in a previous webinar discussing Module 2, Worker Health, Hygiene, and Training. But here are some of the specific requirements that might be valuable to cover again. And that just basically what you see here on the slide is that must never harvest produce destined for the fresh market that has been contaminated with fecal matter. That's just kind of a no-brainer, but it's one of those things that it is required by the rule to observe in practice. If you have dropped produce as defined under the rule, that can never be harvested or distributed. Worker health and hygiene practices should include wearing clean clothing and footwear because you might not be directly touching. Your hands might be clean, but something that otherwise might touch a food contact surface or something destined for the fresh market could come in contact and cause some sort of cross-contamination food safety issue. Following glove, hairnet, and jewelry policies. These kind of go in tandem with any food preparation practice you might know from the fast food industry, but it's a little bit higher of a risk profile here because there's no kill step to kill off any microorganisms. So being especially mindful of these things in terms of produce harvest and post-harvest handling activities. And using worker break areas, hand washing stations, and restrooms. So we discussed monitoring those in a previous module and how you need to do that with the rule, but making sure that these places are used properly and that they're kept up with. And it's important to know that food safety is very very specific to individual operations, right? Because some packing areas that you might be involved in might have an open environment, and some might be a closed environment, such as just a building with 4 walls, windows, and doors, and a ceiling, or you could have more of a pavilion style, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner here. So it's important to note that this rule and the requirements of this rule, it's not done in a monolith. It's not a cookie cutter approach. The more exposure to the elements, the higher the risk profile is going to be for any kind of cross-contamination issue, and the more practices are going to need to be implemented to kind of mitigate those risks. So just kind of keep in mind the uniqueness of your operation is going to vary in how you approach food safety. But there are a couple of themes to kind of keep in mind here. Reducing risks in all packing areas. It's not an exhaustive list that you see, but these are all practices that can be used in packing houses and are just a few examples. One is keeping it clean by sweeping, picking up trash, and removing coal piles, because good housekeeping, as we've discussed, goes a long way. Separating produce handling areas from other farm activities such as vehicle repair, spray mixing, and storage. You don't want to have any kind of cross-contamination there. Providing hygiene facilities for workers. Again, toilets, hand washing facilities, and separate eating facilities and break areas are necessary. Another one here is avoiding standing water. And that is whether in a closed or open packing area, taking effort from reducing standing water and equipment on the floor or the ground, because this also supports the right conditions for the growth of pathogens and whatnot that could splash onto fresh fruits and vegetables, and even equipment that those fruits and vegetables come in contact with, and in turn spread contamination throughout your packing area. Pest management. All packing areas should have a pest management program. And again, it kind of goes back to that discussion of being exposed to the elements, because if you have a closed operation, then you're going to be more able to control what comes in and out of there. But if you have an open operation, it's kind of one of those things. Being organized in terms of cleaning processes and a place for tools and equipment can help ensure they're in good working condition and clean for the next use. Some growers use color labeling. An example is using a green color and remembering, okay, green is clean is kind of maybe one way. Or maybe just having just a general designated area for dirty and clean equipment to be placed in when returning from the field. Having a system can minimize that confusion that might arise. It might make the operation a little more efficient and help reduce risks by ensuring that the cleaning and sanitation steps are done properly each day. Kind of building off of that, you kind of have to assess your risks, right? As in the field, it's important to consider the risk from workers, water, soil, animals, adjacent equipment, surfaces, flood drains, etc., any adjacent land uses that can introduce contamination into packing and storage areas. And a good way to begin that assessment is to kind of map out the flow of produce that's kind of going through your packing area from the field, and then including storage and vehicle. Because when you kind of walk, it's kind of like the saying, you never know what something goes through until you walk a mile in someone else's shoes, right? Well, you can kind of apply the same motif here. When you kind of know the path that your produce is traveling through in this regard, you're going to know the risks that might arise at each turning point. So it's important to kind of walk that journey, so to speak, so that you can see what risk will arise with each passing there. Identifying all surfaces that contact the produce, as well as where the incoming produce from the field and wash pack produce might cross paths in the packing area or cooler. Food contact surfaces are those that are considered zone 1. So those that come in direct contact with the food, right? Like such as a conveyor belt. There's other zones such as 2, 3, and 4 correspond to areas beyond direct food contact surfaces. Now, we're going to kind of distinguish these and tease these examples out a little bit more in the coming slides, but it's important to identify now so that you're familiar with these concepts going forward. And making a list of produce safety risks that are identified during the survey of harvesting, packing, and storage, and the transportation process is important so that they can be addressed during the implementation of a food safety plan, which is what the final module of this webinar series covers. So here's kind of more of a visual representation of the zones. And when you define the zones in a packing house, you can target cleaning and sanitation areas and different areas that may affect the produce, right? Zone 1 you see here is directly in contact with the food surface. Zone 2 is the area immediately adjacent to Zone 1, outside surface of the washer in this example. Zone 3 is adjacent to Zone 2, so here the floor. Think of it as the ripple effect, right? You throw the rock in the pond and you got that initial splash, and then each one of these is kind of a further ripple out from that. Zone 4 is an area that could impact the safety of produce, but it may be outside the packing or produce handling equipment or in the environment. So each zone is described to kind of give you a direct. We're going to go more into these going forward. So this is kind of just a primer and an overview, so you can be familiar with these concepts. The biggest problem that we see is in Zone 1. These are direct food contact surfaces. And examples of these could be belts, rollers, brushes, sorting tables, workers' hands, bins, or sinks. And they're the biggest concern because if contaminated, they can cross-contaminate the produce, which makes more sense when you think about it. But it's important to assess the sanitary design before any new equipment, because if you buy equipment that's easy to clean, right, you're more inclined to clean it yourself because it's an easy task, and any workers that you have are more inclined to do it because it makes an easy task going forward. The produce safety rule does require that all food contact surfaces of equipment and tools used in covered produce activities be inspected, maintained, and cleaned, and when necessary and appropriate, sanitized to protect against the contamination of produce. And if you're thinking of this in terms of maybe a spectrum on how you're supposed to prioritize cleaning going forward, it's best to think of it in terms of the 1, 2, 3, and 4 can also kind of translate into the priority. And this, without saying, does mean that Zone 1 should obviously come first. But it's also important that the regulation does require that growers maintain and clean non-food contact surfaces, such as tools and equipment when necessary to prevent contamination. And areas described in this module as zones 2, 3, and 4 fit within that category. So it's just easier to keep these things in mind going forward. One thing to note in developing sanitation practices that reduce your risks, once a map of the flow of produce through packing areas has been developed, growers, and you've identified the biggest risk, you should develop a plan to implement practices to reduce those risks. Once you have your inventory and you've assessed your needs, then it's time to start executing, right? And if these risks involve concerns about cleanliness of worker hands as they pack produce, you might need to begin training or improve worker training programs. And here's an example of a few sanitation practices to evaluate and consider implementing. Asking yourself, are the belts and brushes that move produce dirty and or frayed? Then at that point, it might need a cleaning and sanitizing program and a standard operating procedure. Are there birds in the rafters? Putting up netting or closing open doors to prevent any entry, maybe practices to mitigate that pest issue. If harvest containers can be easily cleaner if they're designed for single use. If there's broken or old harvest containers, they might need to be replaced with ones that can be cleaned and sanitized more effectively. Does the cooler fan drip? Adding a drip pan to keep that water from going into a manner that's going to increase food safety risks. And again, cleaning coolers, transportation vehicles, all of this is pretty straightforward, but it's just something that needs to be kind of called out and brought to everyone's kind of attention, But it's important to know that there are some differences here, right? And I like to liken the difference of this as cleaning versus sanitizing, right? You cannot sanitize a dirty surface. And the best way to think about this is if you go to your kitchen counter and if you have kids or if you don't have kids or you've been around kids or you were a kid at one point, right? You come in there with dirty hands and you put dirty hands right on the kitchen counter. If you were to go get, rubbing alcohol or something to sanitize that, you're just going to be moving the dirt around, right? You might have reduced the amount of micro organisms on the surface, but all you're doing is really moving around the particulate matter, right? What you need to do is get the soap and water, remove the debris, which would be in this case the dirt from the counter, so that it's a clean surface, and then you can sanitize to reduce anything that would be left over from the cleaning process. And so that's a good kind of contextualizing example that I always kind of like to think of when doing these trainings. And you fall back into your definitions of cleaning being the physical removal of dirt from surfaces, which can include the use of clean water and a detergent. A detergent being just a cleaning agent like soap. Sanitizing is the treatment of a clean surface to reduce or eliminate microorganisms. So again, the takeaway here is just that you cannot sanitize a dirty surface because it is not clean. Kind of spelling this out a little more, step by step, step one is just removing any physical debris and obvious debris from a food contact surface, kind of going forward. And step two is, applying the appropriate detergent and scrubbing the surface, making sure that you have the right cleaning agent and that you can use you can use any kind of scrub brush or sponge or whatever you're cleaning with to get that debris kind of going and removing the soil. Rinsing the surface with clean water and being sure to remove all the detergent and soil. So just like washing your car, guys, think of it like that. You got the soap and water on there, you're getting all the dirt off, but you got to make sure you got to rinse it to knock all of the things off that you've put on there with the soap and water. Same is true with the food contact surface, and it's pretty straightforward from there. But once you have the surface clean and all the particulate matter is removed, then you can go in and start sanitizing the surface to make sure that you have eliminated the risk of microorganisms being present to a greater degree. And again, it's important to think here that we are not focused on risk elimination. You are never going to be able to 100% get the risk of food safety issues to be zero. That it's not, I mean, it would be useful and it would make an ideal world. It would be great to have a zero-sum game with this. But the thing is, we're focused on risk reduction because the best we can do is get to as close as we can to zero. That should be the best case scenario in the realistic scenario here. And with that, making sure your food contact surfaces don't present that risk, and there's no contributing factors to that. You don't want something that's going to rub a toxin into your food. You're not going to want something that's going to absorb materials because that's going to also be harder to clean. you want something that's going to be durable and able to withstand corrosion, because if something does corrode away, you're going to have particulate matter from that surface possibly entering into your food stream. And also making sure that you're able to be easily cleaned and sanitized is important. The equipment should be designed and installed to facilitate cleaning and sanitizing. Making sure it's easy to access, because if it's harder to do, it's less likely to get done, especially if there's no oversight of that. And you're able to remove and access any accessories necessary for cleaning and sanitizing is the key here. But again, while best case is ideal, best case is not always possible, because this is a new rule, and you got to have resources to comply with the rule, right? And sometimes we have to prioritize our resources in the ways that best make sense to us. And if your operation has older or wooden equipment that is not easily to clean or sanitize, there's still ways to work around it. It's just a little bit harder, right? Knowing that you can still clean old equipment, you might have to clean it more frequently and have some sort of more rigorous cleaning schedule to prevent any kind of buildup. With wooden surfaces, it's important to know that you need to air dry those surfaces. You just can't pat them down, because they're a little more of a permeable surface that's going to retain water easily. And making sure that equipment and tools that cannot be cleaned or maintained properly might need to be discarded. But key here is making sure that new equipment and buildings are designed to be easily cleaned and sanitized. Because while you might not want to, lose the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, you still want to go ahead and make sure that whatever you're putting in going forward is going to implement new best practices going forward. And it's important to know that, retrofitted equipment is great when you can make it work for you. But it's important to know that just because you're making changes in equipment, you need to make sure that while some things are more convenient, it might not make it less convenient in other regards. And that includes cleaning and sanitizing to reduce the risk of contamination, using materials that can be cleaned and sanitized. No carpet or materials that cannot be cleaned or do not dry. That's kind of back to that standing water issue. And you might need to consult the manufacturer or a sanitation expert if you're using something that for equipment that for a purpose for which it was not designed. But when possible, it's best to invest in that right equipment, so that that you have the right resources going forward. And these post-manufacturing welds, like shown here, are not easy to clean and may become a source of contamination, because you can see there's different crevices around that, and it makes it hard because it's not a uniform surface to clean. One thing to keep in mind here is reducing risks before entering the packing area. Making sure that clean bins are clean. Making sure bins are clean before using them, and developing practices to minimize harvest bin contact with the soil and remove soil before entering the packing and storage areas. I mean, that makes sense, but the important thing to know here is if you're stacking your bins, obviously you're going to, whatever was on the bottom of the bin that was stacked in the one underneath is then going to be a direct contact with one another, right? And anything that could be present there is going to hold produce later. And so it's important to know that that is a food contact surface and an example of ways to reduce risks before entering the packing area by cleaning these bins off. In developing these is just a good practice going forward, but it also can save you a lot of headache later on down the line. And it reduces the risk of contamination when entering packing and storage areas. Organic load in wash water, the frequency of which wash water needs to be changed, and risks when stacking produce bins on top of each other. So packing area maintenance is another thing. Regularly inspecting and maintaining equipment to avoid, again, standing water, cracked hoses, improper seals, dirty conveyor belts, condensation. Routine cleaning and maintenance here, guys, it's just essential because dirty equipment can lead to cross-contamination of fresh produce, which is kind of just the underlying theme of everything we've talked about. But these are some examples to be called out that you could be on the lookout for. And it's important to know that workers be trained in this so that they know how to replace these materials and how to mitigate these risks accordingly, because they not only need to know how to identify them, but be able to handle them so that production can continue without that happening. Again, packing containers and produce packaging can be a source of contamination if the containers aren't clean. Keeping packing materials, cases, bags, or boxes in a clean and dry area that is covered and off the ground so it doesn't become contaminated by pest droppings or anything else like windblown dirt is kind of a good example. Single-use food-grade plastic liners have been used inside in a lot of operations and packing containers to provide a clean surface. But the rule does require that food packing material be adequate for its intended use, which includes being cleanable and designed for single use and unlikely to support the growth or transfer of bacteria. So if you're using reusing materials, you must take the steps to ensure that the food contact surfaces are clean by cleaning the food packing containers or using a clean liner. That is pretty much the gist here, guys, is just making sure that you're not harboring the right environment for those things to crop up. The next couple slides we're going to talk about deal with pest management. And this can include a wide array of things. Birds and rodents are the more common ones. And where you see this being an issue is the fecal matter that's left behind. It's important to inspect points of entry and where this can pose a risk for that happening. And just as with you would with any household, repairing holes or cracks, making sure door sills are in place, because those little suckers can fit through a lot of places. Making sure birds are not in the rafters. Do what you can to mitigate that with spikes or netting or closing the door. Making sure windows are closed too. And you also not need to look within your packing area, but look outside your packing area too. If you have a coal pile outside that might be piling up, that could be a place for rodents to harbor. Cutting the grass around the packing area to make sure you're not harboring an environment for that. Removing those piles and taking out the garbage as needed and every day at a minimum, and keeping the produce covered so that anything from above doesn't end up on it. And here are some more specifics about a pest management program. Obviously, you can use mouse traps to monitor pest activity, but it's important to remember where you put them. Placing them along the walls of packing or storage operations, and at least checking them weekly and keeping a records of when you need to do that. It's important to note, you should never use bait inside of a packing area, because what's going to happen if you use something like rat poison, right? The mouse is going to go off, or the rat's going to go off somewhere and die. Then you're going to have another issue on your hands because you won't know where that is. And we don't have those little suckers on low jack or anything. And it's just like with your house, you might find something decomposing in a produce pile somewhere. Hopefully not, but if you did, that would have another food safety risk that you might not realize until it's too late and someone got sick down the supply chain. So that's very important to know, is just as a best practice is not using the bait inside of a packing area. And training your workers to report these things as they see them, but making sure that the best part of your pest control program is controlling the pests that you have, again, tailored to your operation. Cold storage areas, inspecting those to make sure they're clean and cooling equipment is functioned properly. Condensation or dripping on produce is another water risk that can harbor bacteria or any kind of pathogen. Door and window sills being intact, and cooler temperatures being monitored and recorded at the beginning of each day, because not only are you dealing with cross-contamination, you're also dealing with cooling the produce at the proper temperature so that it doesn't spoil, right? That's just kind of another thing to keep in mind. A cleaning and pest management program should be established for all storage areas. Cooling is not required, but if you have to do it, you do have to do it properly. Ice and ice slurries, if you use these for post-harvest cooling, it must be made from water that is free of detectable generic E. coli within 100 milliliters of water. That is a very specific measurement, and it needs to be, it has to be free of detectable generic E. coli within 100 milliliters of water. So if you take anything away from this slide, that's one thing worth noting. Making sure the equipment is used to make and distribute ice should be cleaned and sanitized on a regular schedule. Storing it in clean containers, again. Do not stacking boxes of ice produce above other boxes to avoid dripping and cross-contamination. And again, many different types of things to consider with transportation, depending on how you take your product to market. Open trucks, closed vans, wagons. Ideally, a vehicle that transports produce should only be used for produce, but that's not always possible, especially on the farm where you have multi-purpose vehicles. I drive a farm truck. I know that you have different purposes for them. Some farms may use vehicles for many farming purposes and for personal use. Vehicles must be cleaned after hauling produce, and a clean liner might be a good idea to put in there as a barrier to kind of provide that extra layer preventing contamination. And as part of that, it's important to know that you gotta inspect your vehicles too, to make sure that they're clean prior to loading, and making sure that they're free of physical debris and even odors, because that could be indicative of a larger issue. If hiring transportation, making sure that those cleaning, sanitizing, and documentation are part of your contract requirements. Making sure that you have a legal way to hold that there. And if you're refrigerating, the inspection should make sure that refrigeration units are functioning properly and at the proper temperature prior to loading, because if not, you might have a standing water issue or even a produce spoilage issue. Standard operating procedures are good because they guide in cleaning and sanitary practices to help ensure they are done correctly. It kind of establishes that uniform set so that worker one might not be doing something in a way that's different than worker two, and you have at least a baseline for the way things go. And this slide provides a pretty good list of some SOPs that you might want to consider in your food safety plan. But anything that needs to be done here is make sure that you're writing these clearly and concisely so that anyone can understand them, regardless of their qualifications or their training. And to test an SOP's effectiveness, you should give it to someone else to read. The best way to understand if something's going to be understood by a third party is to make sure that maybe a friend or family member or someone on the operation can read it and say, okay, well this is an unfamiliar, this makes sense, or you might want to clarify that here. Getting that additional input's always good. It's important to know that microbial risks are not the only ones, but there are other ones. We talk about the ones that you think of: E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria, but keep in mind that there are chemical and physical risks too. To go along with this. So that's kind of an additional layer to discuss. Chemical hazards, chemical food safety risk can come from improper application of pesticides or other chemicals, such as detergents and sanitizers that are used on or near the produce. Being sure to keep chemicals and cleaning supplies in a location away from fresh produce handling areas. Put them in a locked storage area or a separate shed. And making sure that workers follow the SOPs that you clearly define when and how much of chemicals are needed to be used to complete a task properly. Safety data sheets should be on site or accessible in case of a medical emergency. Oils and lubricants from equipment should be food grade if they are used anywhere near fresh produce. And the rule here is just to follow the label instructions for application and proper use. When you're using new food contact equipment on the farm, be sure the material does not react with any of the sanitizers or chemicals used for cleaning and sanitizes, because heavy metals can leach under certain conditions and end up contaminating produce. Physical food safety risks can be present if any foreign material comes in contact with produce or produce handling equipment. An example would be broken glass from a light fixture, especially in packing or storage areas. Sleeves and light guards could prevent glass from shattering and entering into that. Metal from equipment can also be an issue if you have a screw or a bolt. Some farms may want to install metal detectors to make sure metal does not end up in the finished product. And if it's going to a food processing facility, such as apples to a baby food manufacturer, the processor might also require that. Wood splinters are a risk and may be common when using wood pallets or bins. And setting a schedule to inspect the equipment and packing areas to reduce these risks is important to mitigate that. Corrective actions are the next thing we'll talk about. A corrective action should be taken and documented if food safety risks are identified in the packing, washing, storage, or transportation of produce. And it's important to think about both long-term and short-term solutions. How can you fix a situation immediately if something comes up, but how can the event be prevented from occurring again in the future? The corrective actions are good for helping fix those problems, guys, determining its cause, and modifying practices to be sure that this does not happen again. Examples of times of when corrective actions are needed are here on the slide. For one scenario would be pest infestations. Action should be taken to remove and manage pest infestations. And this could include just hiring a pest controller company, setting up traps, netting or other actions for birds, inspecting produce to make sure it has not been contaminated by pests, injured workers in a packing area. Workers should first seek medical attention, having the proper first aid kits, making sure that you've cleaned surfaces that might have been come in contact with bodily fluids such as blood. And if there's not a large volume of produce that has been affected, the lot itself may need to be discarded. Notifying the owner and manager about injuries and contamination issues, and all of these actions should be documented. Drain backup, making sure that that's monitored, because again, as in this slide, that can produce standing water, and just keeping in mind any other things specific to your operation that might need to be addressed. As always, records are critical to making sure the job is done and done properly. Record keeping can be facilitated by large clipboard logs hung over a convenient location or inserted into plastic sleeves taped to the walls where an activity is happening. There are many cleaning and sanitizing practices that need to be done on the farm. This may include even delegating some of those tasks to others, but you have to be sure that all workers know their responsibilities and what records to fill out. And there's a series of templates available at the website for Cornell, who was the drafter of the produce safety curriculum. So to summarize, all packing areas, regardless of age or design, must have sanitation practices that minimize contamination risks. You need to identify all food contact surfaces as produce moves through the packing and storage areas. Focus on keeping these as clean is the first priority. Knowing that cleaning and sanitizing are not the same thing and that you cannot sanitize a dirty surface. And food safety practices such as cleaning, general maintenance, and housekeeping and pest control need to be in place to reduce these risks. And at this point, I will stay around for a few more minutes if there's any questions. But again, please feel free to reach out to us if you have some sort of issue or there's a question that doesn't come to mind today. That is, we're always here if you have some sort of issue you can't really, you've tried and you can't untangle, we're here, and if we don't have the resources for you, we can research it and get back to you or get in touch with one of our sister organizations that might be able to better assist on the ground if that's not something we're able to assist with. So again, reaching out is always always welcome. With that, I don't see any questions. So at this time, I will like to thank you guys for joining us today. And again, if you would like to send any emails, if you have questions, my email is gbjakso@uark.edu. And additionally, you can find our team's contact information at indigenousfoodandag.com. Again, that's indigenousfoodandag.com. With that, I would like to thank you guys and hope that you have a great day. And again, please feel free to reach out if anything comes up.